will begin in 8 minutes. 8 minutes. Five minutes. 5 minutes. Three minutes. Let's do an audio test for the panelists. Michael, Susan, and Frida, just unmute yourself.
Okay, this is Michael Barone here. Can you hear me?
You're coming through well. Thanks, Michael.
Hi, this is Frida. Are you hearing me well?
You're doing fine. Thanks, Frida.
Hi, it's Susan. How are you?
Very well. Thanks for joining us. You're all coming through loud and clear. We'll start in 2 minutes.
Thank you.
Carrie, we should do your test too. Are you there? Can you unmute.
Hi, how are you?
Perfect. Okay, thanks. I have 1 minute to begin. 1 minute. Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Council of the Americas. Welcome to our final plenary session for the 2020 Washington Conference on the Americas. This will be a session that will focus on what happened in the U.S. elections just 1 week ago. And it really just has been 1 week. It seems like a lot longer than that. What to anticipate going forward, and what it all means for the United States, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and indeed the rest of the world. My name's Eric Farnsworth. I'm very pleased on behalf of the Council of the Americas to welcome you to this important, timely signature event. Despite the pandemic, since June, we have delivered an amazing disaggregated conference beginning with the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, speaking on U.S. policy toward the region. We have also featured two sitting Latin American presidents, the head of the World Bank, and cabinet officials from the United States and elsewhere. We're fortunate that our sessions have been viewed literally by tens of thousands of people, and our audience today is similarly robust. As the premier policy and business organization for the Americas, it's a testament both to the professionalism and creativity of our staff, as well as to the generosity of our sponsors and members. By now, of course, you know who our conference sponsors are. Our presenting platinum sponsors, Chevron, General Motors, and Merck, known as MSD outside the United States and Canada. Our gold sponsors are Chiquita Brands, Freeport McMoran, Integra Capital, MetLife, the Principal Financial Group, Repsol, and Sempra Energy. Our media partner is the Financial Times. We sincerely thank each of them for standing with us during this uncertain, challenging period. And we thank the State Department Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs, led by Ambassador Michael Kozak, for their continued partnership to make 50 years of conferences a tremendous success. Our session today will be slightly different from before. In a moment, as we have done previously on a bipartisan basis, we'll share with you a video testimonial on the importance of the Washington Conference on the Americas by a former Assistant Secretary of State and conference co-host. I'll then introduce our panel moderator, who will conduct our keynote panel of internationally recognized political analysts. After the panel, we'll have a keynote interview of Senator Ben Cardin. And then, to wrap our conference up tightly with a bow, we will feature a short musical performance to highlight the amazing music program of the Americas Society. It's not always easy to introduce culture to Washington, so it's often said, but we're willing to try. And we really hope you'll stay online for this musical capstone, a thoroughly refined way to conclude our 50th annual conference event. We have an amazing morning ahead of us, and we are so pleased that you're participating. And we hope that this will also whet your appetite for the next time we're able to hold our conference in person. To get us started, we have prepared a short testimonial video as we have featured in previous sessions. This one with former Assistant Secretary of State Roger Noriega. Ladies and gentlemen, former Assistant Secretary Noriega.
The Council of America's annual Washington Conference has been a tradition, an opportunity for private sector representatives and public officials from the United States to get together to compare notes about conditions in the Americas and opportunities for us to grow together in every sense of that expression, to promote security, economic development, and our mutual interests, consolidating institutions. I was honored to have been introduced by David Rockefeller when I was Assistant Secretary, and we used that opportunity to roll out our message, the conscious decision of the Bush administration to fight poverty by making capitalists of even the very poor, by giving them access to, yes, political power through democratic institutions, but also economic power, to give them the access to take full advantage and grab their fair share of economic growth in the Americas. And we did trade agreements in the Andes, as well as the CAFTA Dominican Republic Free Trade Agreement. What we're confronting today is a reality where a decade later, a good deal of Central America, 3 or 4 of the parties to that free trade agreement are worse off now than they were then because of the challenge of transnational organized crime, which has really decimated institutions in these countries, challenged them, not only in terms of corruption, but also gang violence. And so we need to confront these realities head on. And the private-public dialogue is extraordinarily important to do that. Now, obviously, you cannot bring people together at the State Department in the middle of this COVID. Even if you did, you can't have people travel from other countries, which is also an important part of that dialogue. So the Council of the Americas has introduced a series to continue that contact, that exchange of views, which is, as I said, more important than ever. Because as government authorities are dealing with the COVID crisis and how we respond to that, the private sector really needs to be doing some thinking about what governments, societies, countries need to do in order to incentivize investment and economic growth to jumpstart the economies, not only in the United States, but also throughout the region, and pull out of this economic spiral. We have to do that. And that's why that dialogue is extraordinarily important. Something else that makes this next 6 months important is elections in the United States. Well, the Council of the Americas has unique credibility as a nonpartisan organization to lead that discussion. And I certainly hope that private sector folks will join the council to put their questions forward, put their vision forward, and also to use the council as a forum to make its views known to policymakers, not only in the United States, but throughout the region, about what governments have to do to make private sector growth a reality, to have a robust recovery from this COVID crisis. The Council of the Americas is in the middle of that discussion, and we certainly hope that our friends from throughout the region and throughout the United States, U.S. companies and other multilaterals, to come together to make their contribution to that productive discussion about the future of our region. Thank you.
We very much appreciate that testimonial from former Assistant Secretary and conference co-host Roger Noriega, as we have featured videos of other former Assistant Secretaries and conference co-hosts on a bipartisan basis for previous sessions of our 2020 Washington Conference on the Americas. It's now my privilege, and it is indeed a privilege, to introduce an international media personality and also a personal friend, our keynote panel moderator, Bloomberg TV anchor Sherry Ahn. Sherry is the co-anchor of Bloomberg Markets, as well as Bloomberg Daybreak Asia and other programs. She's a highly decorated journalist with experience across Asia, including Tokyo, Hong Kong, and Seoul, in addition to her current position based in New York. That part you probably already know. What you might not know is that she was raised in Bolivia. She's truly multicultural across Asia, Latin America, and North America, and she speaks fluent Spanish, as well as English and at least 2 Asian languages. She really is a treasure. We're so fortunate to have attracted her back to the Washington Conference on the Americas, and we're looking forward with anticipation to the session she'll lead. Ladies and gentlemen, panel moderator, Sherry Ahn.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me, and thank you so much, Eric, for having us all back. It's really a privilege to be back. These panels with the Council of the Americas, America Society, are always so timely. This has been one of the best times to actually try to dissect what's happened over the past week. And I believe many people right now will be very curious as to what exactly happened this presidential election season. And it's such a good time to just stop, breathe, take it all in, with the understanding that, of course, we're not really done, but for now, we can stop and just take it all in. Of course, this is an unprecedented time. We have a health crisis in the United States, economic challenges, the stakes have been very high. And no wonder we have seen this historic voter turnout, which is now projected to be the highest in more than a century or so.
Sherry, could you turn on your video, please?
I hope this works, and thank you so much for that. Yes, as I was saying, very critical time, unprecedented with the virtual challenges as well. The video is telling me that it cannot be started. I will try to log back in. Thank you so much for holding on to here. I'll be back in a second.
Okay, folks, well, we are in a virtual reality. And there you are, Sherry.
You know what? This is even more fun than live television, because this is exactly what happens live on television, and we have all seen the whoopsie daisies on live TV trying to get through this virtual.
It's not a problem. With good humor, we can get through the pandemic. So back over to you. Thanks again.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for bearing with me. I am very technologically challenged, as you can see, but I'm very happy to be here. So let me just bring in our panelists, and we have a star panel, and I'm so happy to be here. Michael Barone, Senior Political Analyst at the Washington Examiner, Frida Geddes, World Affairs Commentator and Columnist at CNN, The Washington Post, World Politics Review, Susan Glasser, Staff Writer at The New Yorker and founder of Political Magazine. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. I just want to remind our virtual audience that you are also part of this conversation. If you have any questions, please send them to Eric. You can send them privately to Eric, and he will relay it to our panel, and we can have a conversation. And of course, to our panelists as well, if you're not speaking for a long time, you can mute and unmute depending on the situation. And Susan, I think we have yet to see you as well. There we go. Thank you all for being here. I just gotta start with, let's just take it all in, as I was saying. I mean, guys, what just happened and what is happening right now? And I am so excited to have this conversation right now, because we just need to take it in, right? Just stop with the barrage of tweets, stop the television. Let's just talk about what's going on right now. Susan, you want to start us off? Just give us a sense of what's happening, your takeaway from this past week. And you are still muted.
All right, here we are. This is a Zoom era classic. Thank you so much, Sherry, for doing this, and to everyone who's dialing in today. I really appreciate it. And I feel like one of the challenges is, this is not yet a past tense situation, and that really is what takes us into uncharted waters. We're a week past the election day, and we are really dealing once again in the Trump era with a kind of unprecedented situation where the president has continued to refuse to accept the outcome of the election. He is not only refusing to accept it, but I think challenging the legitimacy of the very institution of voting in a way that is really putting us in uncharted waters. It suggests long-term risks for the United States that go far beyond the question of him leaving on January 20th. Just a quick, update for those dialing in from Latin America or elsewhere. Right now, we're in a situation where it appears that we're headed towards the exact same electoral college result as 4 years ago, that Biden would win with 306 electoral votes. Right now, his lead in the 3 states that were key to Donald Trump's victory is 214,000 votes and counting. Donald Trump won those 3 states by 77,000 votes. It's a classic moment of, I would say, shocking but not surprising, which in many ways is what I think we've come to expect from the last 4 years, which is a lot of blowing past of the norms of American democracy in ways that would be shocking or even career-ending for other politicians. And yet, in this situation, the president said for months that he would refuse to accept any outcome of this election that did not include him winning. Well, that's, of course, not how it's supposed to work in a democracy. And so, we'll see. The experts suggest, and, frankly, common sense would suggest there's zero possibility for him to overturn the result in multiple states when there's A, no credible allegations of fraud at all that have been surfaced so far, B, the count continues, and C, the history of recounts in the United States suggests that at most you're moving a few hundred, maybe 1,000 votes, and we're talking again about significant leads in every single one of these states that's close. So it's a big picture for us to consider a week after the election day.
Biden's campaign is now threatening to go and challenge and put legal action in order to start setting up their transition team and start moving. Michael, your thoughts? You've got to unmute yourself as well. All of our first answers will be like this now.
Okay, I see the election is very close again. Susan made a point that the 3 states in which were critical, with Donald Trump carrying by 77,000 votes 4 years ago, produced a larger margin for Joe Biden. But if you take the smallest 3 states on the current counts, Donald Trump's actually Joe Biden's victory, and I think it is clearly a victory, seems more contingent. If you look at the current counts in Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin, 3 states without which Joe Biden would not be president, even assuming that Pennsylvania number 20 electoral votes stays in his column, which I do so assume. He's currently carrying them by 49,000. He's got a solid lead in the popular vote, but of course the popular vote in the United States under the Constitution doesn't declare the outcome. His campaign is pursuing some legal challenges, but from what I have seen so far, some of them may have some merit, in the sense that there were rules broken in the election. None of them seems to rise to anything like the extent that we that would justify an overturning of the result in one state, much less at least 3 states in which you'd need to overturn the result in order to produce a different result. But I think this is still, in some sense, what I wrote 20 years ago, a 49% nation. Susan says that we've never seen anybody accepting an outcome before. We saw strong litigation by both the George W. Bush campaign, which was leading in the counts as they came out, and the Al Gore campaign in 2000. My own belief at that time and this time is that both campaigns were entitled to advance their positions as in order to win an election, which there was depended on the result in one very close state, 537 votes. You had about 10,000 votes shifting at that time. I don't expect to see anything like that now. The other thing I'd say is about Congress. We expected to see a Democratic Senate based on the polls. We don't have that. We have the Republicans currently holding the Senate. That's contingent on their winning the 2 elections in runoff elections in early January in Georgia, where the Republicans were narrowly leading Democrats in the votes cast in the first outcome, but nobody got 50% of the vote. Those are staying up. In the House of Representatives, we expected widely noted David Wasserman of the Cook Political Report, probably our eminent expert, said 5 to 10, 15 or 20 Democratic gains. Looks like that's wrong. It's going to be about 10 Republican gains in the House of Representatives. It will be a narrow and working majority for Speaker Nancy Pelosi, but a lot closer than people thought. So I think I wrote 20 years ago, after the Florida controversy between Bush and Gore, that we were a 49% nation. I wrote yesterday that I think we are still a 49% nation. But of course, we've got a different party in control of the executive branch with some very different ideas on foreign policy, and we will see how that works out.
So let me turn to that point. It wasn't necessarily a blue wave, but as you mentioned, we do have the 2 runoffs in Georgia, and that takes me to Frida. Just give us your take of the election season, but also what is going on in Georgia right now?
Yeah, I'm interested to note that both Susan and Michael acknowledge that the election was clearly won by Joe Biden. So Georgia has become the epicenter of the next battle, as you noted. And that may help explain what has been happening in the past few days and hours. The aligning of so many major Republican figures behind Trump's effort to either overturn the election results or delegitimize Joe Biden's victory. It really undercuts Biden's opening message of reconciliation, the hopes that he would be able to bridge the divide that has become so deep and inflamed in recent years. As soon as Trump started attacking the results in a way that most objective observers can say is not only disruptive but contrary to reality, he served Joe Biden with an opening to his incoming administration that can be really, really harmful. The question now is whether the Republican Party, Mitch McConnell, Lindsey Graham, other members of the Senate who are lining up so solidly behind Trump are doing this because they intend to become obstacles to any efforts by Biden to bring some sort of reconciliation, to cool down the temperature in Washington, or whether they're doing this to try to energize the base in Georgia. And there's some validity to that argument because Mitch McConnell, even though he is known to have a good relationship with Biden, the election in Georgia will affect his position more than anyone's. If the two runoff races in Georgia go to the Democrats, Mitch McConnell will lose his position as one of the most powerful people in Washington. He will not be majority leader in the Senate anymore. He will not control the agenda anymore. So what I'm looking right now most closely at is how far this close alignment behind Trump's disruptive reaction to the election, how closely the Republicans are going to stay with it. I think it could do a lot of harm to the incoming administration, which we now know is going to be a Biden administration.
Michael, we have seen, though, Mitch McConnell and Joe Biden work together in the past, right? Whether it's on budget issues or other areas of cooperation.
We have seen them work together in the past on that budget issue, in particular when Joe Biden was the vice president. President Obama wasn't able to reach an agreement with Mitch McConnell or with the Republican Speaker John Boehner. And Joe Biden was able to do so and able to push that through. So these people had been Senate colleagues and so forth. I think something should be added here when we're talking about reconciliation. The Democrats basically did not accept the result of the 2016 election result. They continued to undermine the administration of Donald Trump with what turned out to be a totally evidence-free hoax of Russian collusion. They were not able to produce that and so forth. I think some acknowledgement by Democrats that their claims that the administration, that Donald Trump's campaign result was an illegitimate result produced by Russian collusion with Russia would assist the process of reconciliation. I haven't heard that yet. Perhaps it will come.
Susan, your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I would note that it's particularly ironic to hear that kind of a comment on, the 4-year anniversary of the day that President Obama hosted Donald Trump in the Oval Office and Michelle Obama hosted Melania Trump in the White House. Hillary Clinton conceded the race within hours of it having been called. And, it's unfortunate that this argument of so many of Trump's, supporters at this point, revolves around a sort of reality denying. Like, I watched that concession. I'm sure that Michael did too. This is really an extraordinary moment. And I would like to point out to people, because I think it's important that, even 2000, first of all, was a remarkably close election in the history of recent presidential elections. In the end, something like 500,000 votes separated Al Gore and George W. Bush. And the thing is that we were lucky enough when that very stressful and difficult process in Florida was over, that we had both a gracious winner and a gracious loser, and that both of them were concerned about bringing the country together. Both of them understood that this could be perceived as a crisis of legitimacy in our democracy. And I think that obviously, we're in a very different place as a country right now. And so I think, the concern primarily, I think, is really a question of we come out of this a changed place, right? Regardless of, okay, are we going to have a transition on January 20th? And I certainly believe that will be the case. And I hope for all of our sakes that it goes as smoothly as possible. But I do think we're not the same country that we were before we've experienced the norm shattering and the truth defying of the last 4 years. And so,
Susan, would you take issue?
Democracy.
Would you take issue with calling Trump not a legitimate president when he was president in office?
Sorry, Michael, did you not watch the concession of Hillary Clinton 4 years ago? And
I watched the concession, and I also noted that she called him an illegitimate president when he was in office, that Joe Biden did. I think that there's need that both parties have misbehaved in significant ways on this, and I would like to see them each of them behave better.
And that's the point right now, right? We are already seeing the divisions of minds, of opinions within this panel, and we're only 4 people here. Take a look at the broad America, and we are seeing this civil unrest even during the election campaign. Count the vote, stop the steal. How do you overcome that? How do you heal the divisions and you start listening to each other? Especially, I believe, at a time when we continue to see these threats that perhaps President Trump will not go quietly. We have already seen the firing of Defense Secretary Mark Esper just on Monday through a tweet. Are we going to see more actual action coming from the executive branch that could make this whole process more difficult come January 20th?
I would predict not. We will see. Donald Trump has surprised us before, but I think that the legal cases that have been made, that are being attempted to make by Trump campaign associates, are basically not going to go anywhere. And I think in lieu of, and that will become apparent. And at that point, the transfer of power will take place, perhaps as grudgingly as it did when John Adams lost to Thomas Jefferson, or John Quincy Adams lost to Andrew Jackson in 1801 and 1825, when the outgoing president did not attend the inauguration of his successor. But I think the transfer of power will take place, as it should.
So I just would like to add that the prospects for this effort at reconciliation to really collapse are increased in direct proportion to Trump's participation in the political atmosphere during the Biden administration. I think that Trump is not going to go away quietly, and he is not going to stay quiet. I think Trump is going to be making noise. He's going to be attacking Biden for years to come. He's going to be riling up his Republican base. He's going to be intimidating Republican elected officials who try to work together with the administration. I think Trump is going to continue to be a problem, not just for Biden, but for the country. He's going to continue to raise the temperature on political differences in the United States. And I think that's going to be an issue for the United States for years to come.
You can't really expect anything else when he is the head of basically Red America, right? We are talking about millions of people voting for President Trump more in 2020 than they did in 2016.
Well, let me just make one point about something that maybe is not well known to people outside of, I happen to be in Georgia right now, and there's a little bit of a civil war breaking out within the Republican Party in Georgia. The two Senate candidates, the two Republican Senate candidates, have written a letter asking the Secretary of State of Georgia, who is also Republican, to resign because of the way the elections were handled. And the elections, as it happens, were really well handled. It was a very positive surprise for Georgians who have seen so many shenanigans over the years. So he is refusing to resign. He's saying, "What are you talking about? The elections went very well." The lieutenant governor, another Republican, said there's no evidence of fraud. So the Republican Party in Georgia has a big split, and we could see something like that nationwide, a division between the more Trumpist side of the party and the more traditional part of the Republican stream that wants a more functional government.
We also saw in Georgia after the 2016 governor elections. I'm sorry. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I think that Frida's making an important point as far as the Republican kind of rift that we're going to see open up. You saw this in Pennsylvania as well, where you have the state's retiring Republican senator and former senator and former Republican officials saying, "Wait a minute, why is the president attacking the legitimacy not only of an outcome here, but of vote counting that is taking place in many instances by Republican-led state, county, and local governments. And that's the remarkable thing about America's decentralized election process, which is something that I think is important for non-U.S. observers to take into account. It's both the great weakness of our system in some ways, right? In the sense that it's disorganized. Remember all the chaos in Florida and the hanging chads and the endless opportunities for, kind of local incompetence or, whatever. But the flip side is it also makes it a strength in a situation like this. You do not have the ability in Washington to dictate an outcome. You have a situation where there are stakeholders in communities. These are your neighbors who are counting these votes, and they're Republicans as well as Democrats. And so to perpetuate a big lie, which is that there is some kind of massive conspiracy across multiple states in this country that somehow enabled Republicans to win office at the House level at the Senate level, at the local level, but just those ballots that involve, the exact same ballots are somehow flawed when it comes to the presidential voting. And to impute the integrity and the professionalism and to say that there's some kind of fraud going on when it's Republicans as well as Democrats who are counting these votes, it's much harder. And so that's why you see people like Senator Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania saying, hey, wait a minute, why is the president of the United States attacking my state, which elected?
Well, I think Pat Toomey,
to respond to that.
Pat Toomey said that
conversation. Go ahead.
Pat Toomey had said, and I agree with what Susan was saying along those lines, the senator who's retiring in 2022, he's got 2 more years on his term, is, he hadn't seen evidence of fraud. There have been occasional charges that Republican observers were kept out of the election, but this is nothing. I don't see any basis here for overturning the whole thing. There are sometimes localized things. I would just add to what Frida was saying in Georgia that 2 years ago in 2018, the Democratic candidate for governor, Stacey Abrams, lost by 50,000 votes. She said the system was illegitimate. She hasn't changed that view. Hillary Clinton said Stacey Abrams is a legitimate governor of Florida. I think this it fortifies my earlier conclusion that prominent members of both parties have misbehaved on this count, and I hope they would behave better.
So, I know we want to move on, but I just have to say the election in which that Stacey Abrams said was illegitimate was an election that was so profoundly flawed, beginning with the fact that the man who was overseeing the election, the Secretary of State, was the candidate running against her. So the election, the situation in Georgia has changed completely. There was a massive voter suppression effort when Stacey Abrams was running for governor. The election is much more transparent in Georgia. So I'll leave it at that so we can move on.
Let me just state for the record that I don't agree there was a voter suppression effort. They were calling the rolls in the way that the federal legislation required.
To this little bit from Susan's latest column, a superpower torn apart from within, no longer trusting of its own democracy, which takes me actually a question from our audience who says, what does the example do for the U.S. ability to promote democracy abroad? What are the lasting effects? I want to talk more broader foreign policy issues. So, Susan, why don't you go ahead?
Well, thank you, Sherry. I'm glad to bring it to that, sort of bigger picture question, because that's sort of a point that I was trying to make is that, it's the attack on democracy itself and the idea of the illegitimacy of the election, I think that is not the first, but the latest in a series of blows to this idea of the United States as any kind of beacon of democracy around the world. And you look at the sort of sustained assault that we've seen in the last few years, really so unprecedented. It's still hard for people to kind of wrap their minds around it, where, we have clearly had a president who has been much less comfortable with our allies than with some of our adversaries. And, the optics will be easy for a President Biden, I think, to overcome, in the sense that just like when Barack Obama came in after George W. Bush, who was very unpopular with, in particular, our Western European allies, Obama then gets a rapturous reception. I think that, the optics will be much easier for President-elect Biden to fix than to actually restore a sense and in a belief in American leadership in the world. I don't think that we can just sort of snap back. And I remember being at the Munich Security Conference when former Vice President Biden, right before he announced his campaign, there was his first big speech where he's talking about foreign policy, and essentially his message to the rest of the world was, we'll be back, which is a backward-looking message, right? It's sort of like, hey guys, hold on, just keep our place warm at the head of the table, and I think that's naive to a certain extent. I understand why he says it, but I think that the crisis of confidence is two main things. One, just quickly, it's the idea that America's word is no longer good. that why make deals with the United States if 4 years from now, in our 49% nation, we're simply going to throw out the new administration? Why make an Iran nuclear deal if the next person is going to undo it? And so I think there's a crisis of confidence in America at its word. And then the other thing is, as long as we are this divided and we can't even agree upon basic facts about what has just happened inside our democracy, of course, it's very, very hard for us to be anything other than inward looking at this moment of profound crisis domestically. And that compromises our role in the world. So those are the two big things I would spotlight.
Michael, that seems to be a certainty. I mean, with the Trump presidency, we have seen the United States withdraw and sort of isolate itself from the world. Can America re-engage with the world? Is that the path also that America needs to take?
Well, we've engaged with the world in a variety of ways, some of which Susan is arguing have been dysfunctional, and some of which Joe Biden has been arguing. I'd like to put a question
with its own allies. It seems that's a big issue.
I'd like to put a question to Susan and Frida, who I suspect are better informed on this than I am. One of the things that we noted on election night and pursuing the election returns is the strong move of Hispanic voters in Florida in particular, but also in Texas, in Georgia, and North Carolina, giving Donald Trump higher percentages of the vote than he received 4 years before, higher percentage than other Republican candidates for president and other office have. In particularly in Miami-Dade County, where you have a lot of people of Cuban and Venezuelan background. There was a big movement there away from the Democrat towards the Republican Donald Trump. We saw the same thing with Puerto Rican voters in Osceola County, Florida. We saw it in the lower Rio Grande Valley. We saw it in Lawrence, Massachusetts, the most heavily Hispanic town and city in Massachusetts. Is this going to affect a policy towards Latin America? And in particular, one of the themes that was used by the Republicans was we're against Castro, we're against socialism. Clearly, the Trump administration pursued a very different policy with respect to Castro, with respect to some extent with Venezuela. Are we going to see the Biden administration going back to the opening up on to the Cuba that was pursued in the Obama administration? What are the prognostications for that looking forward?
Frida, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I'd like to first, before I get into that, I just want to comment on what Susan said. That I think it's so important. The loss of the status of the credibility of American democracy is not just a loss of global influence for the United States. It is a loss for democracy around the world. It means that America's efforts to help countries strengthen their own democracies are going to be weakened. And I think that's really sad for the world. I think it's very sad for the really urgent need to stop this global authoritarian drift. So, on the Latin American voters, that's, something that's been remarked, and it's not surprising. I was watching what was happening in Florida, and I think the most important factor in hurting Biden in Florida with Latin American voters, with voters of Latin American descent, was the lie that Biden is a communist. And that is a campaign strategy, a campaign tactic that worked, that was enormously effective in Florida and across Latin America, by the way. I've been shocked to hear from people in several countries south of the border that Biden is actually a communist. I had somebody tell me that.
Will that hamper Biden policy making because he doesn't want to, actually do things that might make him look closer to Cuba and Venezuela?
I think for the earlier part of his administration, I think he's going to avoid some of these more controversial aspects of foreign policy. I think he may loosen up the approach. That rhetoric will certainly cool down towards Cuba. I don't think he's going to make any major reversals right now, and not for a while. And because of Florida, because of electoral domestic reasons in the United States, Cuba is always very, very complicated. But the Latin American vote in the United States is often misunderstood. The people from Latin America, Hispanics, whatever you want to call them, are so different from one another. There are large numbers of very, very wealthy, highly educated people from Latin America, and there are large numbers of very poor people who have come to the United States. There's everything in between. There's every ideology. There's every level of religious devotion. There's every level of political ideology. There's every level of personal interest. So Latin America, the Hispanic vote cannot and should not be viewed as a right. single block. It's just so different. And we saw that in the elections.
Susan, what are you expecting? And also adding to that point from Frida, that we're not going to see big changes, at least controversial in the beginning of Biden's presidency, just the fact that he hasn't really made it clear if he even wants to return to the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, actually, because as much as I mentioned, that his sort of overall message is, hey, world, we'll be back. There are some details that will be very interesting where he differs from Obama. And I think Michael's right to point out, we don't really know what his approach will be when it comes to snapping back, to the status quo ante on something like Cuba. I do think that, Biden, what he's made clear from the very beginning is he's going to focus, I think, not in a regional, but much more on resetting the idea of alliances and multilateralism. And he's going to rejoin the Paris Climate Accord on day one. He's going to rejoin the World Health Organization. The question of making and distributing the coronavirus vaccine, I think, will very likely offer a first opportunity for the Biden administration to really focus on reestablishing the United States as a global good actor. And I imagine that is something that they will focus on as a way of reframing the entire foreign policy conversation. You mentioned the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and I think on trade is one of those areas, along with China, where you're likely to see a marked difference from the final years of the Obama administration, both because there's a sense that the politics inside the U.S. have shifted on both of those issues. And so although the TPP was a major initiative of the Obama administration, I think it's very interesting that that's one thing that Biden has not recommitted to re-enter. Although I wouldn't be surprised if they're holding that out as to see how things go in their first round of dealings with China. It seems to me that's also why you might not see them lifting the tariffs that Trump has placed on some dealings with China right away in order to see what they can get from them. But just a final note, though, on Frida's very important point about, what does this mean for the overall struggle for human rights and democracy around the world to have the U.S. So inward looking and so divided. I do think, having watched Joe Biden for many years, both as the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and then in his 8 years as vice president, Biden is actually much more focused on things like human rights and democracy promotion, even than Barack Obama. Obama had a certain realpolitik view of the world. Obviously, it manifested itself very differently in terms of his conclusions and policies than a Donald Trump. But in many ways, it was Obama himself who had a very kind of sanguine view about what the U.S. can accomplish with those kind of efforts. And I think that, I look at Biden's role in particular. He was like the main U.S. principal who was dealing with the former Soviet Union and the countries around Russia, Ukraine, Georgia, that were under pressure from Vladimir Putin. And what you saw was Biden very personally articulating a kind of vision of the U.S. as a leader of human rights and democracy promotion that would recall those who lived through, the late Cold War period. And I think that on China, in particular, you're going to see more of that once again. And I wouldn't imagine that actually on Venezuela, which is important, in this hemisphere, you would see Biden actually taking a pretty strong approach, in my view, which is so ironic to hear, Frida say that, she's getting feedback from people in the region that, Biden is somehow a communist or something. That's absurd, actually. That's an absurd statement and very incompatible with his record as a politician.
Let me
Do you think he would stick with the Guaido government in Venezuela that the U.S., following the lead of multiple Latin countries, have endorsed, but who has not succeeded really in overturning the result of what the United States and multiple governments and the European Union believe was a stolen election by Maduro? Yeah. Have we got a sense of where Biden may go on with? Are we going to drop Guaido, which seems not to be a winning cause there, unfortunately? What's your sense of that, Susan? Have you investigated that?
I haven't, Michael. I'm interested in that, but I don't know. I think that, by inclination, Biden would likely be quite tough on the Maduro government. But as you said, our current policy has not succeeded. So the question would be, what kind of a reset is there? But it's farcical to suggest that he's, a communist or a socialist in any kind of meaningful sense of the word.
Trans-Pacific Partnership is not dead in your view? Or the U.S. participation in that?
No, I don't think it is.
Let me jump in here a little bit more on Latin America. We've mentioned so many topics, so many pieces of the Latin American puzzle. The first obvious thing that we need to note is that Trump spoke very tough line. He talked very tough. There were no results either on Venezuela or in Cuba. The dictatorships in both of those countries are just as strong today as they were before Trump took power and started shifting American policy, especially on Cuba. On Venezuela, the U.S. had a much more high-profile approach to Venezuela, but the United States government, with or without Trump, opposes the Maduro regime. And I suspect that what Biden is going to do, he's going to tighten sanctions against the top figures in the regime. He's not going to loosen America's stance towards Venezuela at all. And it's going to be Venezuela was actually the one foreign policy issue where the United States worked in concert with other countries. I think that will continue. I think it's not going to make headlines the way it did under Trump. I don't think we're going to see foreign policy by tweet anymore. I think diplomacy is going to look more diplomatic now. There's going to be more happening behind the scenes. And I think on something else that Susan was mentioning, Biden's approach to human rights, I think we're going to see that in Biden's approach to immigration, to refugee flows, to Central America. Instead of this zero-sum, you lose, we win approach that Trump has had to all foreign policy issues, to all issues, I think Biden is going to have a more cooperative approach to the immigration issue. I think he's going to try to work with Central American countries on finding ways to relieve the pressure on the populations there that feel that they have no choice but to leave their countries, no matter how difficult the road is, no matter how harsh the American reception is. I think Biden is going to have a cooperative approach to immigration. I think Biden is going to reintroduce something that is desperately needed, and it's attention to corruption in Central America and across Latin America. He's going to reintroduce, and this is going to be done more quietly, but I think you will see more American efforts to help strengthen rule of law, that sort of thing, what Susan was talking about.
In that sense, will it become a little bit of a heavier burden for Latin American countries as well? Because we're not only talking about just human rights and more focus on those issues, but also environmental rights. The regulatory approach to Latin America could be different. And we have seen, of course, the really close relationship and friendship that Brazil's Jair Bolsonaro had with President Trump. He's lost a key ally there, right? And he's getting a lot of heat over the Amazon deforestation.
I think there's no question that President Bolsonaro in Brazil highlighted his similarities with President Trump and his differences. And obviously, President Trump's defeat is a negative for his standing in Brazil, which is dicey in the polls. He's up for re-election. They're having another presidential election in 2022, and apropos of a comment made earlier, Brazil announces its results nationally within about 5 hours. They're real fast on the results, and they've got a national system. They're more efficient than we are. One question I'd have about Mexico, we've had an agreement with, under President Trump, he basically reached an agreement with President AMLO, President Manuel López Obrador. It's known as AMLO in Mexico. basically stopping the flow of so-called asylum seekers and thousands of people coming to the border, and threatening to cut off U.S. aid in various ways to Mexico. And President Lopez Obrador has fulfilled that agreement. He wasn't one of the ones that has initially moved to congratulate Biden as president-elect. Does Biden want to get rid of that agreement and have tens of thousands of people coming to the border once again, as was happening in the first half of 2019? He has talked about opening this up to immigration and so forth. But is that something that we can look forward to in the Biden administration?
I will send those questions, both of them, to Susan and Frida, but let me just add a tidbit that we're getting from our audience. Question related to this: what will be the primary impact on immigration, which directly affects LATAM and Caribbean, Mexico, Central America? Susan, you want to start us off?
Well, it's a very interesting question. I think, the Biden campaign, for understandable reasons, steered very clear of this conversation throughout the election period. Donald Trump made demagoguery around immigration a central part of especially his 2016 campaign. And I noticed in watching, pretty intensively almost all of his final campaign rallies, although it was not front and center in his rhetoric throughout much of this year for President Trump, it remained probably his biggest kind of applause line. There's this, implication, in sort of what Michael suggested and what Trump certainly was running on, this idea that somehow Joe Biden's going to open up the floodgates and just, welcome the world here through the southern border. Obviously, that's not something that they want to do. The one thing he said very specifically is that on day one, he will reverse the policy and reinstate the Dreamers program, which applies, of course, only to people who are already here in the United States. So
for some time,
a clear visibility yet, Sherry, on how Biden is going to approach this, but very delicately, because you do face a big risk factor. If people decide that, suddenly the border is going to be open again on January 21st, even though it's not, that could be a big problem for the incoming administration, aided and abetted by misinformation and by a Republican Party that's determined to keep, kind of sniping on this. So I think it's a very risky policy area. It used to be that one could imagine in the Washington of 8 or 10 years ago. Remember when that was seen as a potential area of bipartisan compromise in the George W. Bush second term? They made this fateful decision essentially not to pursue that as the first thing after he was reelected. And I recently spoke with one of Bush's most senior advisors, who was saying to me, "Can you imagine what a better place we'd have been in a country had President Bush decided to work with Democrats on that as the very first priority of his reelection?" But of course he didn't. And now it's impossible, I think, to imagine after the demagoguery of the last few years that this is something where the two parties can come together.
Yeah, I think the emphasis in that area from the Biden administration is going to be to erase that horrible stench of cruelty that has permeated the Trump administration's approach to immigration at the border. I think Biden has said that he wants to start a commission right away to try to bring back together the children that have been separated from their parents and, they can't find which family belongs together. I think the emphasis is going to be on that. I think Biden is going to be very careful to not allow huge runs of immigrants at the border right after he takes office. I think this is going to be a very slow process of revising Trump's actions in that area. But the emphasis is going to be on trying to erase this cruelty that has become a part of the American policy at the border.
Let's turn to another question. Michael, do you want to respond to that?
No, go ahead, please.
Okay, so we have another audience question. The rift this election puts clearly over the table is the huge difference between populism with different flavors and intensities and democracy. Populism always uses the history of fake news as part of their messages. The big question is why people believe in this. As a Latin American citizen, this rift? Why do they believe in populism? Michael, would you like to go ahead?
Well, I think that you're covering a lot of territory there. I could go starting talking about the Brexit referendum and the election and the Fidesz party winning 2/3 of the votes in Hungary and so forth and so on. And I gather from the tone of the conveyed in your representation of the question that this is a questioner can't imagine that there could be any rational reason why anybody would vote for any of these people. I've spent my professional life trying to understand why people vote the way they do, including those that don't vote the way I do. We could go on at great length, but I think one of the problems we have in this country is that we've got a lot of people, including very many people in the news media, who can't imagine why anybody would vote differently from what they do. And I think it would behoove us all to try and understand each other better.
Can I comment on that? I am one of these people who can understand why people would vote differently than I do. And I see the reasons in many places. I think globalization has played a huge role in promoting and boosting populists in recent years. The world is changing very fast. It's very disorienting for people. In globalization, I think, has promoted inequality in a lot of places, especially in Latin America and in the United States. And I think that has made people open to demagogues who promise to don't offer solutions, but they articulate problems very well. And I think that's something that Trump did very effectively during his 2016 campaign. His solutions, there were no solutions, but when he talked about the problems, they did resonate. When he talked about, when he painted Hillary as being in the pocket of Wall Street, this sense that there's of inequality, of unfairness, that resonates in a world where there's a lot of inequality. I think, the changes in cultural norms and in social norms, I think that opens the stage for demagogues and populists to gain support, even if they don't really offer useful solutions.
Michael, I think in your recent column you wrote about trade agreements and economic policies produced by Trump actually did produce income and wealth gains disproportionately to low-wage workers. So in that sense, has America seen this cathartic moment with all of the frustrations of middle America? But given the fact that we still had 70 million people voting for President Trump, what can we expect in the years ahead?
Well, I think that it's not just actions of public officials or public policies that affect these things or campaign statements. We had a sort of agreement among major party presidential candidates for a period of 30 or 40 years on issues of trade and immigration, in which Donald Trump took an opposite and different view and and there have been, as we look back on what globalization, we find some areas of it have had some negative effects that the two parties, with their consensus, failed to account for. The influx of large numbers of low-skilled people in immigration, including millions of illegals, did probably cut wages of low-skill or low-credential Americans somewhat. And in the first 3 years of the Trump administration, maybe it was just coincidence, but in fact, people with low credentials, people with who were identified as racial minorities, actually saw their income gains be greater than national average for the first time in about 30 years. It's an interesting development. The decrease in immigration, though, in some sense antedates Trump. Our big increase in immigration from Mexico and from other parts of Latin America, huge rushes of people, that basically stopped and went down to net zero after the 2007-2008 recession. It hasn't resumed it, even if we get large numbers of people coming from Central America up to the Rio Grande or across the desert. It's not going to be in anything like the numbers that we had before. But the other aspect of globalization that hasn't worked out as we hoped, the opening to China. Chinese products have cost, academic studies have shown that manufacturing and attendant jobs in the United States have declined more than most of us who advocated freer trade with China. I'm included in that number. Expected that they would. And the hopes that so many of us have had, members of both parties, that as China becomes more trade connected to the world, it would democratize, it will become less threatening in foreign policy. I think it's fair to say that those hopes have been disappointed, have been severely disappointed. To blame, we've got more frayed relations with China now, but I think it's silly to claim that's just because Donald Trump is a difficult person. It reflects some greater reality that the hopes behind our China policy have not proven to be fulfilled. So, I think that it's not just demagoguery, fake news, and lies that have produced results for candidates who are associated with the kind of message that Trump has brought.
Would you agree, Susan, on at least that part, that when it comes to China, there has been a clear shift, whether it's Democrats or Republicans, on what China represents, which takes me to my audience question. What is the true nature of the China challenge in the Americas? What should be the U.S. posture on these issues?
Yeah, I think that that absolutely, it's one striking aspect of the last few years is that you've seen what was previously actually a pretty bipartisan consensus in one direction has now moved to become a pretty solid bipartisan consensus in a different direction. You had two top advisors to President-elect Biden, Kurt Campbell, who led the early Obama administration policy on China, and Jake Sullivan writing a piece just recently in Foreign Affairs saying the era of strategic engagement with China has come to an end. And you do have a situation where essentially Democrats and Republicans are agreeing in their analysis that this idea that you could integrate China into global institutions and, sort of the responsible stakeholder theory of the case, which, by the way, was very similar to the approach taken with Russia. Collapse of the former Soviet Union, in both cases, we've really moved into a different moment in time, and the notion that essentially we've re-engaged in a much more volatile, multi-power world in which great power competition rather than cooperation is the new normal. I think that is broadly accepted. There are wild differences in terms of what that means in an approach. And I think what you will certainly see from the Biden administration as compared with the Trump administration is an effort to work with partners both in the Americas and also in Europe on the idea that this is actually a very solid foundation for common cause, that whereas in the past it was sort of every nation interacting with China economically on its own, that a more common response would now be required, both primarily in an economic sense, but also the U.S. remains a Pacific power, and also in a security sense, which has gotten much less attention, interestingly, in the last few years. Trump really has prioritized the trade aspect of the relationship and a lot of very blustery rhetoric with uncertain results. And so I would imagine that this is something where you're going to see an early initiative of some kind by the Biden administration to find ways to work with allies, again, both here in the region as well as in Europe, on some kind of new economic initiative, number one. Just a quick point I wanted to make on this issue of policy in general versus the politics of the moment. I think that one thing for me, looking at the last few years and, testing our assumptions about politics, which are important to do, I agree very much with Michael that essentially these election results underscore just what a very divided nation it is. It's not we're not in the age where we're going to have wild swings, and we'll get, 55-45 in one election, and then it's going to go to the other party the next time. We have a very hardened political polarization. However, one thing I think the rise of Trump has really led me to think about that's very relevant to our foreign policy conversation is that we analysts, I think, tend to overemphasize the role that policy plays in our elections. And it's understandable. That's what we care about. But if there's one thing the American people have told us pretty clearly, is that they're not policy wonks, and that they're not deeply, that what we thought of as deeply held views of the Republican Party ideologically turned out not to be. For me, that has been really quite revelatory. I felt that free trade was at the core of modern republicanism. I felt that a kind of toughness toward Russia was at the core of what I and others would identify as, principled beliefs of the Republican Party. After all, they nominated Mitt Romney just a few years ago, who said, this was the greatest geopolitical threat faced by the United States. And look at the polls. Look at how the Republican electorate followed the leader when it came to, Trump's views on Russia, literally transforming the polling numbers. And so I think analytically, for me, that's been an important corrective. It's not to say that our policy discussions aren't important, but if you're looking at the United States from the outside and trying to understand what's going on here, I would just remember that a lot of our policy analysis may or may not have a direct translation in political and electoral terms.
Can I get back to the China issue just for a moment?
Susan, before we get to China, Michael, do you have a quick response to what Susan just said, and then I'll turn to China?
Well, I'm old enough to remember when the Democrats were the party for more defense spending than the Republicans, and when the Democrats were the party for more free trade. It's called John F. Kennedy administration. So these things, the parties do change their character over time. I yield the floor.
Frida, talk about China, and also on your point on China, I want to ask for your views also on how China has taken more influence in LATAM as well.
Yeah, what I wanted to mention about China is that there is a tradition now that as soon as a new president takes office in the United States, China tests him. And that has been happening time and time again. The United States is more vulnerable in certain respects now than during a transition than at any other time that I can remember, with internal divisions, delegitimization efforts of the new incoming president, an economic crisis, a healthcare crisis. So I would 100% expect China to do something to test Biden when he comes in. I am remembering how Obama tried his very famous pivot to Asia. And that seemed to the Middle East kept trying to pull him away from Asia. And, the pivot to Asia was really a pivot to China. I think China the pivot may actually happen this time around, because in some ways the Middle East is, in some respects, it's a little bit more stable than it was a decade ago. We have China becoming a much, much more pressing issue across the border politically. And I think someone mentioned there's in fact quite a bit of agreement, bipartisan agreement. So that could be an area where Biden could work with Republicans. China is incredibly complicated. It has so many moving parts that for the United States to deal with. There is the human rights issue. There is the economic challenge to the United States, the economic impact in the United States of China basically monopolizing manufacturing around the world. There is the military issue, the geopolitical aggressiveness of China. It's China is challenging the United States across the board, including in Latin America. China has become the biggest investor in many countries in Latin America. During the Trump years, as he withdrew from Latin America, Trump, I believe, went to Latin America once during 4 years. That's a small fraction of what all the previous presidents did that in modern history. Biden, by the way, has been in Latin America more than a dozen times. I think the United States will re-engage in Latin America, partly because China is engaged so aggressively in Latin America. So I think that is an area where we will see competition, and I don't want to call it a civil war, but it will be a visible area of competition between the United States and China. We will see it in Latin America.
Michael, what do you think of that, and potentially the fact that a Biden administration will have a more multilateral approach in dealing with China? Would that help?
Well, China's doing, aggressive promotion through its One Belt, One Road, through the massive Eurasia and Africa, investment in Latin America, and so forth. One area where he could be more multilateral would be to follow the Obama administration's support of Trans-Pacific Partnership, which Hillary Clinton ditched during the 2016 campaign, and Donald Trump was against it. The argument of the Obama administration was, well, this is a way to set up a economic cooperation agreement that excludes China. I fear that one way that China could test us, and in fact has been testing us, is they're clamping down on freedom of expression in Hong Kong. I know that here in the United States, the tech departments, the tech companies, they're entirely hire totally left-wing Democratic people, are clamping down on free expression here. But that's nothing next to what China is doing in Hong Kong. It's a real terrible violation of human rights in what has been a vibrant community. I fear when I'm sitting up late at night, what is China going to do to Taiwan? What is, the government in Taiwan, as I understand it now, is not a open advocate of independence for Taiwan, which China has long claimed would trigger its response in line with what we've recognized as a one China policy with different versions. But what would happen to Taiwan? That's a real nightmare because, of course, military conflict there. Given the potential for damage to people and property and to things that people have built up for so many years, is just horrifying beyond belief. But could we get lost there? China tested the incoming Bush administration with one plane being flown over Hainan and shooting down one of our patrol planes in the area. But something involving Taiwan could be much more terrifying.
Yeah, we continue to see almost every single day these incursions by Chinese aircraft into Taiwanese territory.
Do you think that's a danger, Sherry? This is a part of the world that you know very well.
I talked about this on Bloomberg a lot, and we were sort of getting ready for these because during my show hours is a time when they always go into the air defense assist zone in Taiwan almost every single day. So we actually had a few analysts join us from Taiwan, and they did not see the possibility of actual physical confrontation, given that the stakes are too high. But they were talking about potentially if China does want to do something about Taiwan, it would be more on the economic front through sanctions. Let's talk a little bit more about Latin America because I'm getting all of these audience questions. And let me turn to you, Frida. One of them is, what can the United States do for Latin America under the Biden presidency? How can the United States assist at a time when they're also dealing with huge problems of their own, like the coronavirus pandemic?
Yeah, I think there are many ways that the United States can and will try to help Latin America. Eventually what one of the main things is to promote investment, but right now that's not the main issue. I think the United States will get involved in helping to strengthen rule of law, offering some public health assistance, offering help with supplies once the United States solves its own problems with that, which incredibly still continue. That Biden has a lot of experience with Latin America. I think he will help with rule of law issues, with mediating conflicts within countries. We saw just yesterday in Peru, a president was ousted by the Congress, and something that just should not have happened. At a time like this when Peru has I think it's the highest per capita number of deaths from COVID. There's this just really, really harmful political infighting that is in the middle of a tragedy. I think the United States could engage more actively in Latin America to help deal with these crises as they arise, while it helps build the foundations for more lasting systems and institutions that can prevent these things from happening. I think the Biden administration is going to come with an approach that is not one of dictating. Is going to be the kind of respectful attitude towards the United States neighbors that Latin America wants and of course deserves. I think we will see that, and we will see, above all, we will see attention, which is what has been missing over the last 4 years. Not just attention to issues like Venezuela and Cuba, which are politically beneficial to Trump, but attention to real problems that may not make the most interesting headlines, but that they are really, really important, like making the law apply to everyone, that sort of thing, like attacking corruption, like strengthening democratic institutions.
We have seen a lot of Biden's efforts during his time as senator on that front with Latin America. Will we see a continuation of that? And Susan, I'm also getting a question from our audience about the possibility of Biden pursuing negotiations with Maduro. How could those succeed if all previous efforts have failed? But of course, I think we've already addressed the fact that any policy on Venezuela at this moment lacks details.
Yeah, I think that's right. Definitely. Look, Frida, I think, has the exact right approach. The coronavirus is a global crisis as well as a Washington and a U.S. crisis, and I think that's where you're going to see a lot of the focus initially on Biden's international diplomacy as well, because it offers him a ready-made way to restore himself and restore the U.S. as a good neighbor. So I would think that that's where you might see some initial outreach to countries in the region would be around the question of the coronavirus vaccine, around the question of what are the economic impacts, which are likely to be serious here in the U.S. as well. And so I would say that for the first 6 months, at least, of the Biden presidency, you're not going to see kind of major one-off regional efforts as much as you are going to see a kind of big picture focus on the coronavirus crisis. And, then they'll probably take their breath and assess where they are after that. Just like Obama coming in the immediate throes of the 2008 recession, 2009 aftermath of that was really the foundation stone of their foreign policy as well as their domestic policy. So that's really where I think we're likely to see the efforts.
Can I just add one comment about, very specific to the question that asked if Biden might negotiate with Maduro? Biden was asked about that once, and he said he knows the problem well. As vice president, he was there as Maduro was taking, clenching his fist around Venezuela. And Biden said something that is very true and something that Venezuelans know very well, that Maduro has used negotiations as a way to drag things out and sap the energy out of efforts to oust them. So Biden is familiar with that pattern. So I think if there is ever a negotiation, it would happen in a way that occurs only as part of a process that has as its end Maduro leaving office. I think it will not be done in a naive way, which is what has been suggested by others.
Frida, would trying to oust Maduro that way, would you use Cuba? Would he use Cuba for that? Would he come closer to the Castros and say, look, I'll give you something in return if you abandon Maduro?
I don't know. That's an interesting theory. I think both of these regimes, the Cuban regime and the Venezuelan regime, they are interested in surviving. And it's hard to imagine that you could offer something to Cuba to abandon Maduro that would allow the Cuban regime to survive. So that seems like an interesting idea, but a very difficult one to execute.
And actually, an audience question, where will Biden go on Cuba, especially with Republicans still in control of the Senate? Of course, after January, we would have to see. But still, if Republicans do hold their majority in the Senate, Michael, is there anything that President Biden can do at that point?
Well, I think as president, you can do a whole bunch without having Congress go along with you. Obviously, you've got the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, on which the ranking Democrat, and who will become chairman, presumably, if the Democrats win the 2 races in Georgia. I don't think they will, but that could happen. Is Bob Menendez of New Jersey, who is of Cuban background and is a strong critic of the Castros. Chairman currently of the Latin America Western Hemisphere Subcommittee is Marco Rubio of Miami-Dade County, Florida. I don't think there's much question where he stands on Castro, and we're going to be hearing from his ranking minority member, Senator Ben Cardin, in this conference. So the answer is, I think that, there's certainly a lot of Latin American experts that say, hey, we should just become pals with Cuba. Maybe they'll become nicer and less authoritarian, stop jailing homosexuals and doing things like nasty things like that. But I think that Joe Biden may also look at those election returns for Miami-Dade County and reflect that Florida is probably going to go from 29 electoral votes to 31 electoral votes as a result of the 2020 census. And the other Democrats who go before the voters may take a look at that as well.
And a broader picture question from a point that Frida made earlier to Michael. Frida, you mentioned this harsh rhetoric against Latin America from the Trump presidency. We have seen years of sort of racist language against Hispanic immigrants here in the U.S. as well. How will the U.S. be able to turn that around, that image that perhaps lots of Latin American countries have of what America has become and how they're dealing with Latin America now?
No, I think that's an issue. That's a question that applies to the entire world. That the next president is going to have a big job telling the world, persuading the world that what they saw from the United States over the past 4 years is not who America is not who this country is. And that's going to be true for Latin America, as it's going to be for Europe and for Asia, for Africa. The United States over the past 4 years was so different from what it has told the world throughout its history that it is. So that's going to apply, equally to Latin America as it does to the rest of the world. As it happens, Biden, I think, has a particular expertise in Latin America, and I think that will help him. I think he has a unique understanding of the interconnectedness of the United States and Latin America, of how the problems, the immigration problem in the United States is not simply an American problem and a North American problem. It's a hemispheric problem. I think he's going to try to attack these situations from a point of view that looks at what in the United States causes problems in Latin America. For example, drug consumption. How each country harms, each region helps and harms each other, how the problems that we face across the hemisphere are so interconnected and cannot be solved by simply looking after the interests of one country.
Okay, so we have about 4 minutes left. And let me just finish on this question that actually connects with the audience question right now. And Susan's, I think, latest column, Biden will America's moral leadership. Our audience question: consider how the U.S. government's promotion of freedom globally could be undercut by our own frightening shift toward freedom press. Can our moral authority persist if we don't address it? So let me start with you. We have about 4 minutes. We'll go about 1 minute each.
Sorry, Sherry, say again the last part.
Will America be able to restore its moral authority?
Well, that's not really a yes or no question. Let's
fingers crossed question.
I do think that this will remain to a certain extent an inward-looking moment for the United States. I think that what you're seeing in terms of the election results and the ongoing crisis of legitimacy in those elections prompted by President Trump is a genuine crisis for the democracy that will outlast what I hope to be the narrow question of, will he leave office on January 20th, which I believe, and I'm going to continue to believe, is the answer to that question is yes. The answer, will that solve America's problems? Will we somehow unite and come together? The answer on that is no. I would say that, one thing we didn't talk about before that I would just leave everyone with is the fragmenting of the media and the assault on truth itself as a value and an important part of American democracy is also probably not a short-term reversible problem. I think it is a poison that has infected our democracy. I think that having spent 4 years in the former Soviet Union, and to think that just a short time after that I would be in my own country and have the President of the United States spend 4 years attacking journalists as the enemies of the people. That is the phrase by which millions were condemned to the Gulag and death by Stalin. It's unthinkable in a democracy. And I don't know what the answer is, but I would say that sure, it's true. We can talk about globalization and the very unequal results from that we've seen in our society and in others as a driver of our political dysfunction. We can talk about the structural problems of our democracy. But I think we've also got to leave everyone with the idea that why this is happening, not just in the United States, but around the world, has a lot to do with an extraordinarily different media environment than the one that any of us grew up in, and the fact that there's a war on truth right now, which threatens every single one of us.
Mike?
I think that the problems we have, the image of America at home and abroad, is more of a problem among elites than among the people. I mean, you could see this in the American election returns where Trump has antagonized upper income, high credentialed voters. To a large extent, he's done better with Hispanics. We hear that he's called racist and everything else. But in fact, when you actually look at what's happened in the voting booths, you see him carrying Zapata County on the lower Rio Grande Valley, where, they're building a wall. That's an interesting datum in my observations, more limited in foreign countries, but not zero, are that the elites always have problems with the United States and the peoples, even in enemy countries like Iran, are more favorable. I see the threat to free speech in the United States coming from the left. I see it on college campuses, which have the least free speech, which have speech codes, which penalize people and try to destroy them professionally and personally if they voice opinions that are outside the left-wing mainstream in those institutions. I see this being applied through the social media by recent graduates, censoring speech and labeling, often on ridiculous grounds, things as fake news. I see the real problem here not as Donald Trump suppressing speech, but as the campuses suppressing speech and the campuses radiating out through social media, through so-called mainstream media, and through corporate human resources departments suppressing speech. That's where I see speech suppression in this country.
Frida?
Yeah, I think America, the United States, has a problem with its image, and that it's not just among elites around the world. Before the pandemic, I spent most of my time in other countries, and I heard from people of all backgrounds. They were shocked at what was happening in the United States. I think this experience of the past 4 years will make the United States emerge as a humbled nation, not falsely humbled as George W. Bush used to try to talk about, but the United States has learned that the problems that afflict other countries afflict the United States also. This problem with demagogues, with populism, with the war on truth promoted over social media is an issue for countries around the world. And I think the struggle that the United States is having with this election, with this presidency, with a president who attacks legitimate journalism, all these struggles that the United States has are replicated in many countries around the world. And I think the United States is in a position to retake its place of leadership if it succeeds in overcoming these problems. I think the United States is not some shining city on the hill, immune, surrounded by waters or by deep valleys that protect it from the problems that afflict the people in the lower reaches. The United States is suffering the same problems, just like with the pandemic. The United States is suffering the same problems. It's facing the same issues that many countries around the world face. And if it can overcome them, it will be an inspiration to the rest of the world.
Frida, Michael, Susan, thank you so much for all your very, very candid views. I know that you still want to keep the conversation going, but we'll have to leave it there. And thank you so much for joining us today. And we'll send the floor to Eric. Thank you.
Thank you, Cherry.
Jerry, thanks very much. Boy, that was terrific. Lively, timely, energetic, exactly what we were hoping. In fact, it exceeded our expectations. So kudos to you, Sherry, as the moderator, and thank you to all of our panelists for your really outstanding comments. And for the audience, you saw real time some of the divisions and some of the challenges within the United States and the things we're talking about right now, which is why we wanted to feature this outstanding panel. We've also gotten already some real-time feedback indicating that this has been one of the best panels people have seen, at least since the elections, if not for some time. So thank you again for that. It is now my distinct privilege to introduce our featured closing speaker, U.S. Senator Ben Cardin. He, of course, is a Democrat representing the state of Maryland. Senator Cardin is a true national leader on issues that impact all of us: healthcare, retirement security, the environment, and budget issues, to name just a few. Senator, my head hurts just going through some of those issues. He is a long-time, effective leader who just knows how to get things done, and that's an important skill, particularly in today's Washington, as we just heard. Senator Cardin has been on the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations since 2007, serving as the ranking member from 2015 to 2017. He's worked across party lines with the likes of the late Senators John McCain and Richard Lugar, and Senator Marco Rubio, to advance U.S. policy interests on human rights, leading efforts to pass the global Magnitsky Human Rights and Accountability Act and the Foreign Aid Transparency and Accountability Act, among many others. And he continues to play a leading role in working to resolve the very vexing Venezuela crisis, among other hemispheric issues. Senator, it's a real pleasure to welcome you as our concluding speaker for the 2020 Washington Conference on the Americas, and to have the privilege to conduct the conversation with you that will follow your initial comments. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me virtually in welcoming to the Council of the Americas, U.S. Senator Ben Cardin. Senator.
Well, Eric, first of all, it's a pleasure to be with you. And thank you for conducting this conference. I think it's critically important that we look at where we are after the pandemic, returning hope and growth in the Americas. So I applaud you for this. I start by acknowledging that 2020 has been an extraordinary year. And that's the understatement of the decade, century. And it continues to be a challenging year. Most recently, with Hurricane Eta and the impact it's had on our hemisphere, our hearts and prayers go out to people of Central America and other communities that were devastated by this hurricane. We all have a responsibility to collectively respond and do everything we can to deal with the humanitarian crisis that has been left in our own hemisphere. This is the most recent of the storms. We've had a record number of storms, just points out how we have a global responsibility to deal with climate change and to try to minimize these types of extreme weather conditions. But as you pointed out, it's been an extraordinary year for many more reasons than just Hurricane Eta. We've gone through so many different durations in this year. The pandemic has hit us hard. And make no mistake about it, it is with us hard right now. The numbers in my own state of Maryland are growing to the record numbers. And we are a state that's had strong leadership from our governor and from our local officials to do what's right in distancing and wearing masks and restricting large gatherings. And yet we still see these large numbers in our state. So the pandemic clearly has been very stubborn. We got some really great news this week with the vaccine. The effectiveness looks really good. The challenge will be to complete the studies and get the production and distribution in a way that will be the right way to deal with this pandemic, not only here in America, but through our whole hemisphere and throughout the whole world. That's going to be a continuing challenge that we're going to have to figure out. The sooner we can get that done, the sooner we can get to, after the pandemic, returning the hope and growth in the Americas. So the pandemic is clearly a frontline issue, and I was pleased to see President-elect Biden address that as his first order priority as the next president of the United States. But Congress needs to act on this. Let me underscore that. In March, when we passed the CARES Act, we did what was right. And it was a strong bipartisan effort by Democrats and Republicans coming together to put the resources out there to deal with the health crisis, not just the direct healthcare challenges and the vaccine development challenges and the therapeutic drugs challenges, but also the challenges with state and local government, the challenges with those that lost their jobs with unemployment benefits, the challenges of small businesses to deal with the lack of business and to be able to stay afloat. But when we passed that bill in mid-March, we really thought the pandemic would be over by the summertime. Well, obviously we were wrong. So we need the next chapter of relief. It's critically important. And the House acted in mid-May, passed the HEROES Act. They acted again a little over a month ago with the 2.0, HEROES 2.0. And that bill needs to pass. We need to pass it now in the slam dunk. We can't wait till January 20th. If we do, this pandemic will have caused much more harm to families here and around the world. And I say around the world because one of the factors in the HEROES Act that hasn't gotten anywhere near as much attention is to provide international assistance to deal with the pandemic. We recognize that we have responsibilities as citizens of the global community. So we recognize that in our hemisphere, we have problems, tremendous problems that need to be dealt with. And even if we do a great job in the United States, if we don't deal with the regional and global issues, then we will not have the pandemic under control. So the HEROES Act, yes, it deals with state and local government. Yes, it deals with our healthcare providers and our schools and our businesses and our families, but it also deals with the global commitments that we have to get this pandemic under control. And then the other extraordinary event in this year of 2020 is, of course, the elections. And it's going to dramatically, I think, change America's role in dealing with the pandemic here in America, as well as in our region and globally. And I say that because there's so many policies that are going to be affected by a President Biden administration. We can talk to some of the direct impacts that will deal with returning to hope and growth in the Americas. We can talk about the issues of immigration policies, which are clearly going to be changed from day one under a Biden administration. We expect that we will reverse immediately the policies that President Trump instituted that affected our dreamers, our DACA registrants, that affected those on temporary protective status, many of which come from our own hemisphere, giving certainty to their status here in the United States and predictability as to their future. We also expect that the discriminatory bans that were imposed in our country will no longer be there, and America will again lead in recognizing that we all have responsibilities to deal with displaced individuals, those that are escaping persecution, they're leaving their countries because of fear of their own lives and their children's lives. That, I think, will change, and America will not only be a better nation when it comes to what we do, but we also will be a leader in the global community, which is going to be very important for our hemisphere, to restore that confidence. So I expect the relationship with countries such as Mexico will be dramatically different, which is a positive sign. And we'll see, I think, changes in the policies as it relates to Central America. Remember, Joe Biden was the architect of the program under the Obama administration that gave hope to the democratic states of Central America to deal with their own internal corruption and security issues, as well as economic opportunities for the future without having to rely on illicit drug activities. I think you'll see that the Biden administration will double down on those types of activities in order to give hope to the people of Central America, put the pressure off of immigration into our southern border, but also give a much stronger future for stability in our entire hemisphere. I also hope, and this is one that is not quite as clear, that will return to a trade policy that will be beneficial to all. We are very happy that we were able to get done in this Congress, the U.S.-Mexico-Canadian Free Trade Agreement That was a major accomplishment, and that was good for our hemisphere. We were not able, and President Trump withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which I think was a major mistake. That would have also, I think, brought about a better attitude within our hemisphere on trade. And then came COVID-19. Then came the concerns about supply chains, as well as the concerns about the spread of the virus. And there was a real effort to say we have to be totally independent on our own needs, and therefore we need to close the supply chain gaps that we currently have that rely upon imports from other countries. And that has caused a lot of restrictive trade policies, not only here, but around our hemisphere and around the world. Question is, can we return to better recognition that we all do better when we have fair trade, when we have a level playing field, and we really do allow all economies to grow through international trade because we're in a global economy? To me, that's going to be a real challenge in the Biden administration, and one I look forward to hoping to see that we can deal with in a constructive way. I do want to mention one issue, Eric, that you mentioned, which is human rights. Look, we can talk a long time, and I can give you my views about the Trump administration. I heard the tail end of the last panel, and clearly President Trump, to me, his failure to tell the truth to the United States and the global community, his failure to engage the international community, isolating America, and his failure to stand up for the values that make America the great nation it is, were some of the greatest shortcomings of his administration. So as we look to engagement in our own hemisphere, it needs to be wrapped in the values of that make for global commitments to good governance and human rights. And I think you'll see that in a Biden administration. Yes, I worked very closely with the late John McCain to establish the global Magnitsky statutes to make it clear that if a country allows for those who violate basic human rights to go with impunity, that we would impose sanctions in the United States, and it worked. And Europe has followed suit, and we've seen other countries follow in our path. I think President Biden's foreign policy will be wrapped in our values, which will allow us to establish in our hemisphere the commitments to basic human rights. Clearly, we have challenges in Venezuela today. We need free and fair elections in that country, and that's going to be a challenge. There is no military solution here. It's got to be done through diplomacy. So we have those challenges. I've worked very closely with Senator Roy Blunt in regards to Colombia. We have had, I think, a real path towards establishing the democratic human rights rules in that country and an economy that does not depend upon drugs. We need to continue to build on the progress that we've made there. Obviously, Brazil presents new challenges to us. We recognize that. We have to figure out a path towards how we can come together. I want to see America with a stronger role within the Organization of American States and with trade within our own hemisphere. And we clearly need a more effective policy as it relates to Cuba. Clearly, I supported President Obama's path to eliminate the barriers towards open communication and relations with Cuba. But I also recognize that Cuba is one of the worst countries when it comes to the human rights of its own people, and we need to be very, very clear about that in our relations. So bottom line, I am optimistic that we will return to hope and growth in the Americas, that we will get past the pandemic. And with the new administration, with the Biden administration, to me comes new opportunities in our hemisphere to make significant progress. So thank you for conducting this. I do acknowledge that in these areas, there's probably more bipartisan agreement than in many of the other areas. And I hope that we'll be able to build on that in the 117th Congress.
Senator, thanks for your comments. More importantly, I want to thank you for your leadership in the Senate on these important issues through the years. You really have been committed. I heard somebody describe you the other day as somebody who is quietly effective on these issues, and I think that's a real compliment. So I want to thank you again for joining us on those comments. We do have time for some follow-up questions, so let me jump right into that. And, you mentioned the trade agenda. We are big believers in the power of trade done right in the Western Hemisphere and indeed around the world. You're really a practitioner of the art of the possible. And I wonder if you could just give a sense of what might be possible in the next few years in terms of expanding trade between the United States and the Western Hemisphere. Is USMCA a basis for that? Should we be thinking in bilateral terms, supply chains? I mean, help us think that through from a political perspective, what might be possible and what people might be able to swing behind and support.
Eric, it's a great question. This is a very challenging area. Make no mistake about it. The frustrations in the economy are always taken out that it must be someone else's fault. So why don't we close our borders? And we're clearly going through very tough economic times, not only here in the United States, but around our hemisphere and around the world. So it clearly will challenge us. There's no question in my mind that there will be significant obstacles. The USMCA is a model. I think we should look at that. It had, Congress was very directive in the trade promotional authority that we passed. It included provisions I've worked very hard on and got into it, including good governance, including environment, including labor. So that was including intellectual property, including so many different areas that were carried out with the USMCA. So we do think that's a model. Before we withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, I thought that was a model that we should be using because it dealt with countries that were not market economies. We're dealing with countries that have had a long history of communist type systems, such as Vietnam. So, but it dealt with it in a way that we could open up the country to reform through trade so that they could achieve better governance and they could respect the rules of market economies in establishing international trade standards. To me, that's where we need to move forward. What worries me greatly, is that China is gaining more and more strength globally in economics. They have a pretty strategic plan and they've stuck to that strategic plan. Make no mistake about it, they're not a market economy. And they want to determine the rules of engagement rather than allowing the democratic free market states to determine the rule of engagement. And under the Trump administration, America's influence was marginalized because we went it alone rather than dealing with other countries of like mind. That's why, to me, the withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership was a major mistake. The fact that we imposed sanctions against some of our closest allies for reasons that were ridiculous was, to me, wrong. And the fact that we went against China unilaterally without having the support of the international community. So I hope our lesson is we need to expand the rules of engagement among market economies so that as we move forward, we build on the progress we've made in the past. We expand it to deal with the realities of today's markets, which means we insist upon good governance, anti-corruption provisions in trade agreements, and that we should have basic labor standards in agreements, and we should recognize that we're all citizens of the same globe, and we need to have environmental understanding as to we move forward. If we do that, I think we can make progress.
And just having leaders and advocates expressing those views in terms of the importance of trade and economic links with the Western Hemisphere is hugely important to keep it right at the top of the agenda. I'd love to explore that topic in greater depth, but in the short time we have, I also want to touch on a couple additional questions. The first of which is in the panel that we just had, there was a lot of discussion about the Hispanic vote. What is it? What's the importance? Florida, Arizona, et cetera, et cetera. I don't want to rehash that, but I would love to get your views on what are the lessons that should be drawn in the context of the Hispanic vote in the United States. Obviously, in the state of Maryland, it's a very important part of politics and growing. How should we be viewing these? What are some of the lessons that could be drawn from the recent election?
Well, first, let's be clear. The Hispanic community is not a monolithic community. They have different views. And when you take a look at the Hispanic community in southern Florida, which is the politics of that is very much tracking what the politics of Cuba is about. It's different than the Hispanic community in the Southwest or the Hispanic community in Maryland. So there are different concerns. But I do think there's some common threads through the Hispanic community. I think the language we use is very important. And I think President Trump lost a lot of support in the Hispanic community because of the language and then his policies as related to immigration, which was just against the values of America. So I think inclusion is very important. Opportunity is very important. What we do in regards to our economic policies. I've been directly involved with Senator Rubio, the Republican chair of the Small Business Committee from Florida, on how can we reach the minority communities on entrepreneurship with small business concerns, et cetera. And I think those policies are extremely important to the Hispanic community. The wealth gap is clearly there. Our healthcare policies are important. We know the Hispanic community suffered more with COVID-19 than the general population. How do we deal with those issues? They're the issues that are going to drive the political calculations within the Hispanic community moving forward. There are going to be economic, healthcare issues, and I think value issues. And the more that we recognize that in the policies of this country or the policies of our political party, the greater numbers we will get and the participation levels. The participation levels were extremely high this go round, which was a good sign for our democracy, but also for the influence of the Hispanic community in American politics.
Yeah, and building on that, every election cycle, we talk about the Hispanic vote and perhaps implications for U.S. policy toward Latin America. What does it mean? And I wonder, based on what you just said, and the recognition that domestic policy is often the driver of U.S. foreign policy from whatever side or issue, how would you see this impacting what the U.S. might be seeking to do in the context of the Western Hemisphere? Let's put Cuba aside for the time being, but just broadly speaking in that context, if you have thoughts along those lines.
Well, you're exactly right on this. I think the first area you'll see the impact will be immigration policies.
Yep.
The Trump policy was very much driven by his base politics, which was put a wall between Mexico and the United States, ban certain people from coming to this country because of where they come from, and that let's not dilute the purity of America, nationalist type tendencies. They're very dangerous for many different reasons, but very offensive to the Hispanic community. So I think our relationships with Mexico, our relationships with Central America, our relationships with countries in our hemisphere are going to be very important to the Hispanic community and very important to America. So yes, I really do think you'll see some tangible change immediately. We have in Maryland, we have a larger number of those under TPS than we do under DACA. And both communities are extremely important to our general community, but with special emphasis on the Hispanic community. So I think there are going to be very important signals as to recognizing two things: that American values are for helping people that are under distress and giving certainty to those who have been in our country for a long time towards citizenship. But secondly, it's going to be important to the Hispanic community.
You mentioned TPS, temporary protected status. That's been a dividing point between President-elect Biden and President Trump in the context of Venezuela. But broadly speaking, the two policies or intended policies seem to line up fairly closely. And I wonder, you've been a leader from the Senate in terms of Venezuela and trying to forge a path forward that's meaningful and actionable and that will lead to results on the ground. What wisdom would you have for us in that context? What can the new administration, what should the new administration be doing on Venezuela in coordination, in conjunction with the U.S. Congress to try to help restore democracy to that troubled country?
Well, let me acknowledge, Eric, there's not going to be a simple answer here. We've seen these conflicts, unfortunately, remain frozen for way too long of a period of time. The real losers are the people of Venezuela. They're suffering dramatically as a result of this conflict. We clearly are on the right side of history as far as supporting the free and fair elections within Venezuela and the right of the Venezuelans to determine their own leaders, and that the fact that Maduro administration just is not a legitimate administration. I think that's an area that brings Democrats and Republicans together, but more importantly, it brings America together with most of the countries in our region. We need to build on that coalition so that we isolate the Maduro regime and the criminal elements that he has that are supporting his efforts. Sometimes we don't know who's in control, whether it's the criminal elements or whether it's the Maduro regime. But we really do need to consolidate the work. We have not been as successful as I think we need to be effective here. We have to work for humanitarian aid for the people of Venezuela, as well as putting maximum diplomatic and political pressure for free and fair elections within the country. And then we have to help the border countries, particularly as it relates to a number of displaced people that have come into their country. It has a dramatic impact on the stability of so many countries in that region. We have to help them through this crisis. So there's a clear role we can play. And you're right, TPS for the people of Venezuela should be a no-brainer. And quite frankly, it's not a partisan issue. It may have been for Donald Trump, but I don't think it is for Republicans in the Senate. So I've talked to so many Republicans who tell me frequently that they like TPS because these are people who legally came to America to escape persecution. That's what this country's about. So we believe in that, or to escape dangerous situations. Sometimes there are weather events that brought people to our country, but they think there should be predictability and pathways to citizenship for TPS. And by the way, there's also bipartisan support for the Dreamers, but it's sort of a different coalition that supports the Dreamers and TPS, but it's still both bipartisan, and we really should show by example. That will also help us, by the way, resolve the problems in Venezuela if we're with the people of Venezuela. And so I think there's a path forward. It's going to require patience, and it's going to require a lot of diplomacy to get a much stronger isolation of the current regime.
As has often been said, if there was a magic bullet, somebody would have already shot it. So yeah. Indeed, no, I think your sobering analysis is spot on. It's going to take a lot of work. Our time is very limited. We only have about 1 or 2 more minutes remaining. Let me toss a blue sky question at you to the extent you're willing to respond. The U.S. is set to host the next Summit of the Americas in 2021. And as of now, the date and the location haven't been set. But I wondered, based on that opportunity, how should the United States be positioning ourselves in the context of the Western Hemisphere? What could be our priorities? How should we be positioning ourselves in the context of a hemispheric relationship?
It's a great question, and I expect I'm going to have some conversations with the Biden transition team. There's a couple of things we need to do better than we've done in the past, and it gives us a chance by hosting this event. I think we have improved our participation in the Organization of American States, even though it's located in Washington. I think we're out of sorts with so many countries in our own hemisphere. We need to pay more attention to the smaller states. The Caribbean island states have been targets for interest by a lot of non-democratic states. We have to recognize that they have challenges. They've been hit hard by the pandemic. They've been hit hard by Venezuela. They have energy issues that we need to pay attention to. So the Caribbean states are an area that we need to pay much more attention to. We have not completed the Northern Triangle. We really need to have a strategy here. I think President-elect Biden will be off and running from day one. He knows that region well. And I think we really need to implement a strategy in the Northern Triangle for so many different reasons. It's not just the immigrants coming to America from that region, which is still a heavy number, but it's also the drug trafficking and so many other areas, and the fact that it causes stability issues in other countries. So I think the Northern Triangle needs to be a major focus. And then we really want America to be engaged as a trusted partner in our hemisphere. For too long, we've ceded that and we were not part of some of our hemispheric groups where Brazil and other countries exercise much more influence than we do. I think we got to recognize that. There's some trends happening in other countries that we have to counter in order to make sure that our hemisphere remains the commitment to democratic states. And we have a couple of examples that we need to deal with in Venezuela and Cuba. But I do feel that that leadership of America is necessary in our hemisphere to preserve our reputation as the hemisphere for democratic states.
Your insight on the Caribbean, I think, is such a key point, because these are countries that are important in the hemisphere context, particularly in trying to rally the international community on issues like Venezuela, like global climate change. I mean, these are island nations that are directly affected by rising sea levels, et cetera. Well, we could go off for a long time. I know your schedule is tight, and unfortunately our time has expired. But Senator, I just want to thank you again for joining us, for your insights, and I hope that we can count on you to continue to be a strong voice for the Western Hemisphere and U.S. policy there. We need it, and we really look forward to continuing the discussions with you. So thank you very much again.
Again, Eric, thank you for doing this. I think it's extremely important. As we say, we have to take care of business at home first, and that means our hemisphere. So it really does need to have a higher priority on foreign policy.
Absolutely. Couldn't have said it better. Thank you again, sir.
Thank you.
Well, now, ladies and gentlemen, to conclude our 2020 Washington Conference on the Americas, we invite you to stay on for just a few minutes more, 8.5 minutes more to be precise, to enjoy a very special musical performance and to relive some of the highlights of conferences over the years. Mariela Condo is an indigenous Ecuadorian singer who has released 5 critically acclaimed albums with traditional and original songs, both in Spanish and Quechua. Along with her band, led by guitarist William Fernando, and with the generous support of BMW, she recorded the following mini concert in Quito specifically for the purpose of closing our virtual 2020 Washington Conference on the Americas. We're delighted to highlight the outstanding music activities of the Americas Society, our sister organization, and delighted to have the opportunity to close our conference with this 8.5-minute mini conference. Ladies and gentlemen, enjoy.
Florcita de las cumbres, florcita de las nubes, flor de las alturas, florcita de alto páramo, florcita de alto frío, flor de pajomales. En tus cumbres juegan enamorados, la inquieta nube y el ancho viento. Déjame tararear tu melodía de pétalos color lila. Florcita de quebrada, florcita de montaña, florcita de quebrada, florcita de montaña. Florcita de la tierra, florcita de la lluvia, flor de nuevos cantos, florcita de montaña, florcita de quebrada, deshoja tu canción. distingo lo negro del blanco y en el alto cielo su fondo estrellado y en las multitudes el hombre que yo amo. Gracias a la vida que me ha dado tanto, me ha dado el oído que en todo su ancho graba noche y día, grillos y canarios, martillos, turbinas, ladridos, chubascos y la voz tan tierna de mi bien amado. Gracias a la vida que me ha dado tanto, me ha dado el sonido y el abecedario, con él las palabras que pienso y declaro, madre, amigo, hermano y luz alumbrando la ruta del alma del que estoy amando. Gracias a la vida que me ha dado tanto, me ha dado la marcha de mis pies cansados, con ellos anduve ciudades y charcos, playas y desiertos, montañas y llanos, y la casa tuya, tu calle, tu patio. Duerme, duerme, negrito, que tu mamá está en el campo, negrito. Duerme, duerme, movila, que tu mamá está en el campo, movila. Te va a traer codornices para ti, te va a traer rica fruta para ti, te va a traer carne de cerdo para ti, te va a traer muchas cosas para ti. Y si el negro no se duerme, viene el diablo blanco y ¡zas! Le come la patita, chacapumba, chacapum, apumba, chacapum, va. Duerme, duerme, negrito, que tu mamá está en el campo,
Well, that concludes our 2020 Washington Conference on the Americas. It's been an amazing run. We'll do it again this coming year in 2020. Hopefully, we'll be able to do it in person, and we look forward to seeing each one of you there. We trust you've enjoyed what we've been able to offer since June in this signature conference of the Council of the Americas. My name is Eric Farnsworth. Thank you again to our sponsors. Thank you to our speakers. And thanks to all of you for joining us for what has been a magnificent series of activities. With that, we'll see you again soon.